For more than 2 centuries, the spiral appeared in storms, rivers, rail lines, flight paths, and failing systems. And somehow, in record after record, one detail kept returning. Not a number. Not a place. A man. He was never listed officially. Never photographed clearly. Never named with certainty. But he appeared before the pressure shifted. Before the storm divided. Before the line bent. And when Eleanor Hayes finally compared every record side by side, she realized something impossible. The man who had guided the observers through the spiral had been standing near the pattern for more than 250 years. In forgotten places, where wind carries memory, where silence watches patiently, justice does not shout. It whispers. And every act leaves an echo. This is Whispers of Reckoning. The morning after the decision line bent in Kansas City, Pine Ridge felt unnaturally calm. Not because anything dramatic had happened in town. The courthouse clock still marked the hour. The diner still opened before sunrise. A delivery truck still rattled past the bakery and stopped half a block too far before backing up into place. Everything looked ordinary. But inside the Pine Ridge archive, the meaning of ordinary had changed. For 250 years, the spiral had lived in records. Then it became visible in real time. And now, after the Kansas City corridor stabilized without cascading, Eleanor Hayes understood something she had been avoiding for weeks. The records were not only preserving the spiral. They were preserving someone who had always been close to it. Michael Carter returned early, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee and a folder of overnight messages from the silent network. Lena Vermeer in Rotterdam had confirmed that the North Sea shipping pressure had fully eased. Kenji Tanaka reported that the rail timing anomalies in Osaka had quieted without further intervention. Melissa Grant in Kansas City sent a careful summary of the 6-minute adjustment and its effect on the corridor. Every message pointed to the same truth. The system had bent. Not broken. And yet none of that was what held Eleanor's attention that morning. She was standing at the long table near the archive window with 6 open ledgers, 3 journals, the wooden box from the locked cabinet, and a spread of copied notes from older county reports laid out in chronological order. Michael set the coffee down beside her. You did not sleep. Eleanor did not deny it. I kept thinking about something. Michael glanced over the papers. The familiar spiral marks appeared again and again in the margins. Storms that changed direction. Floods that diverted. Work crews that stopped at exactly the right moment. Pilots who altered course before corridors hardened. But there were other marks too. Small handwritten notes. Observations added in a different hand. Descriptions of someone present before the event fully unfolded. Michael looked more closely. This is not system data. No, Eleanor said quietly. It is witness language. Michael moved beside her and began reading. A plain-coated man stood near the dock before Hale recommended the heading change. Another page. An unfamiliar visitor asked the bridge engineer whether the river felt heavier than usual. Another. A quiet traveler appeared at the Pine Ridge archive on the evening the storm record was rediscovered. Michael looked up. The stranger. Eleanor nodded. She pulled another copied page from beneath the others. This one came from a county report written decades before she was born. A short handwritten note had been added in the margin. Same man as before. Dust on boots. Calm voice. Asked no favor. Left before the pressure shifted. Michael felt a chill settle through him. He had seen that man in the airport parking structure after Flight 872. He had seen him in the archive. He had watched him stand near the window while the global spiral formed. At first the presence had seemed symbolic, almost like a convenient shape the pattern took when observers needed guidance. But the records on the table suggested something else. The man was not merely recurring in story. He was recurring in history. Michael spoke carefully. How many times? Eleanor lifted a stack of notes bound with twine. I stopped counting when I reached 19. Michael stared at her. 19 mentions of him. 19 direct mentions. She tapped the other pages. Possibly more if we include descriptions without certainty. Michael reached for the earliest paper from the wooden box. The 1773 Atlantic record from Jonathan Hale contained no official mention of a stranger in the main entry. But Eleanor had placed another sheet beside it, written later in a different hand. Michael read slowly. Hale later described a passenger on the lower deck who asked if the sea felt divided before the captain altered course. Passenger name. Not preserved. He read it again. Then a third time. The wording was too familiar. Not the exact phrases they had heard in Pine Ridge, but the same posture. The same pattern of presence. Someone appearing before the pressure shifted. Someone asking a question that focused attention rather than giving direct orders. Michael looked at Eleanor. You think it is him? Eleanor answered without hesitation. Yes. Michael turned to the next paper. London. 1829, the engineering note included a margin reference. A visitor from the river survey paused and asked whether the men trusted the bridge more than the water beneath it. India. 1899, an unfamiliar man in plain clothes advised that high ground westward felt quieter. Kansas County Rail note, early 20th century. Same calm man observed near signal office before manual halt. Michael set the page down carefully. This is impossible. Eleanor did not argue. It should be. Michael looked toward the archive door, as if the man might step through it simply because they had begun talking about him directly. The room remained still. Only the courthouse light shifting across the floor suggested that time had not paused. He lowered his voice. People do not appear in records for 2.5 centuries looking exactly the same. Eleanor folded her arms. I know. Michael glanced toward the spiral map on the wall. For weeks they had been asking what the spiral was. A pattern. A system. A record of balance. But now another question seemed to rise out of the papers themselves. Who was the man who always stood near the edge of the pressure field before the line bent? Michael spoke the thought aloud. He does not stop events. No. He does not force decisions. No. He just appears. Eleanor nodded. And somehow people notice what they would otherwise ignore. Michael thought of their first conversations with him. He had never commanded. He had never claimed authority. He simply asked the kind of questions that turned attention in the right direction. What happens when pressure reaches a limit? What does the system need? What choice arrives earliest? Michael felt the full strangeness of that pattern for the first time. The records are not only preserving the spiral, he said. They are preserving his method. Eleanor's eyes shifted to him immediately. Yes. That was the part she had been circling all night. Not only the man's appearance. His behavior. He always arrived before the redistribution. He always shifted attention without overtaking it. He never made the decision himself. The observers did. Jonathan Hale still suggested the course change. Melissa Grant still chose the 6-minute adjustment. Michael still deviated west of the storm. The stranger did not author the outcome. He made recognition possible. Michael sat down slowly, as if the act of lowering himself into the chair might help his mind settle around the implication. So what is he? Eleanor looked at the spread of records. A witness. Michael shook his head slightly. No. More than that. He pointed to the pages. A witness watches. He positions. He frames. He teaches people how to see pressure. Eleanor looked toward the spiral map again. In the early ledgers, the observers were isolated. In the global spiral, the network had awakened. And near both kinds of events, the same man appeared again and again, not as a ruler, not as a rescuer, but as someone preserving the continuity of recognition across generations. The thought settled into her with quiet force. What if he is not just part of the records, she said. Michael looked up. What do you mean? Eleanor spoke slowly. What if he is one of the things keeping the network from disappearing between eras? Silence answered first. Because the idea felt both unreasonable and perfectly shaped to the evidence in front of them. Jonathan Hale noticed the pattern, then vanished into history. The London engineer left his bridge notes. Harold Bennett carved a spiral into a compass. Each observer carried something forward. But the stranger, if it was the same man, carried something else. Continuity. Michael exhaled. You are saying he is the line between observers. Eleanor nodded once. The man who was always there. At that exact moment, the archive computer chimed. A new message had arrived from the silent network. Subject line, historical image query. Michael moved to the screen while Eleanor followed. The message came from Sofia Alvarez in Buenos Aires. She had been reviewing digitized infrastructure archives after the Kansas City event. Attached was an old scanned newspaper clipping from 1911. A wildfire had weakened unexpectedly after a volunteer fire crew changed position. In the blurred photograph beneath the article, most faces were indistinct. But one figure near the edge of the frame stood in a plain coat, boots dusted pale, head turned slightly away from the camera. Michael felt his chest tighten. Even through grain and blur, the posture was unmistakable. Eleanor whispered before she could stop herself. It is him. For the first time, the man in the margins was not only described. He had been caught by history for a fraction of a second. And he had been there long before either of them was born. Outside, a wind moved softly through the maple trees beside the courthouse. Inside the archive, the papers on the table no longer looked like scattered anomalies. They looked like a trail. A trail left not only by the spiral, but by the one man who seemed to know where it would appear before anyone else did. And for the first time since Eleanor opened the first journal weeks ago, the center of the mystery was no longer only the pattern. It was the person who had been standing quietly beside it all along. For the next hour, the Pine Ridge archive became less like a research room and more like an evidence table. Eleanor Hayes cleared the central work surface completely. She moved the ledgers into one stack, the copied notes into another, the early papers from the wooden box into a third. Michael Carter pinned Sofia Alvarez's grainy 1911 newspaper image to a cork board Eleanor usually reserved for property maps and historical zoning records. Then he stepped back. Even blurred and reduced by age, the figure in the photograph carried an unsettling familiarity. Plain coat. Dust on the boots. A posture that seemed calm without looking relaxed. The face was turned just enough to avoid certainty, yet not enough to dismiss. If the image had appeared alone, it might have meant nothing. But it had not appeared alone. It sat now beside witness notes from the Atlantic, London, India, Pine Ridge, Kansas rail reports, and modern network observations from the present day. A pattern of presence had begun taking shape. Eleanor stood at the table with a pencil in hand. Let us stop thinking about him as a mystery for a moment, she said. Michael looked toward her. And think about him as evidence. She nodded. If the records described the same man, there should be consistent traits. Michael understood immediately. Description first. Meaning later. It was the same rule pilots used after an unusual event. Do not begin with explanation. Begin with what can actually be verified. He pulled a clean sheet of paper toward him. At the top he wrote, recurring figure, comparative descriptions. Eleanor began reading from the earliest note again. A passenger on the lower deck asked if the sea felt divided. She paused. No age given. Michael wrote it down anyway. Then they moved to London. Visitor from the River Survey. Coat dark. Voice quiet. Asked whether the men trusted the bridge more than the water. India. Unfamiliar man in plain clothes. Dust on shoes despite rain. Directed attention westward. Kansas County Signal Office. Same calm man as before. Hat in hand. Spoke briefly. Left before the halt. 1911 newspaper image. Male figure. Plain outerwear. Position at frame edge. No engagement with camera. Pine Ridge Archive. Plain coat. Dust on boots. Calm expression. As if expected. Airport parking structure. Plain coat. Calm voice. Said pressure responds. Michael stopped writing and looked up. That phrase again. Eleanor nodded. He never speaks much. Michael glanced toward the notes. But when he does, he says almost exactly enough. That was one of the strangest consistencies. The man did not overwhelm a situation with authority. He did not provide detailed instruction. He asked questions or spoke short sentences that shifted attention toward the pressure field itself. Not what people should feel. Not what they should fear. Only where they should look. Eleanor added another line to the sheet. Behavioral consistency. Michael raised an eyebrow. She continued. He appears before redistribution. He is noticed but not introduced. He leaves before the event fully closes. Michael wrote each point down. Then he added one of his own. He never claims authorship. Eleanor looked at him. Meaning? He never says he caused anything. Michael tapped the pencil gently against the page. He does not speak like a prophet. He speaks like someone preserving alignment. The phrase felt odd when spoken aloud, but it held. The man never seized the center of a moment. He kept the observer in the center. Jonathan Hale still advised the captain. Melissa Grant still made the 6-minute call. Eleanor still opened the ledgers and placed the pins. The stranger did not replace judgment. He clarified it. The archive computer chimed again. A new message from Rotterdam. Lena Vermeer had titled it, Possible Historical Match, Port Records, 1884. Eleanor opened the file. Inside was a digitized harbor ledger from the Netherlands. Most of the page concerned ordinary cargo scheduling. But a handwritten note had been highlighted by Lena in yellow. Michael leaned in as Eleanor read aloud. Unregistered traveler observed on quay before route reassessment. Clothing unremarkable. Boots dusted despite wet stone. Asked whether the harbor master trusted the schedule more than the tide. They both went quiet. The wording felt almost like a cousin to the London Bridge note. Not identical. But shaped by the same mind. Trust the structure or trust the pressure beneath it. Michael said softly, that is him. Eleanor did not answer immediately, because another detail had caught her eye. A witness age estimate had been added in the harbor master's later annotation. Age appeared middle years. No visible sign of hurry or strain. Middle years. Not young. Not elderly. She looked back at the 1911 image. Then at the airport memory in her mind. Then at the man who had stood in the archive only the night before. The age did not drift the way it should have over more than a century. Not obviously older. Not obviously changed. Michael saw the realization move across her face. You noticed it. She nodded. He does not age in the records the way people age. Michael looked again at the comparison page. No single witness note could support such a conclusion. Memory distorted. Language compressed. People described strangers poorly all the time. But across enough records, a pattern became harder to ignore. Not proof. Pressure of evidence. Eleanor spoke carefully. Either generations of people are describing different men with impossible consistency. Michael finished the sentence. Or we are dealing with the same man. The archive fell silent again. Not because the idea was dramatic. Because it was almost too plain. The records were doing what records always do. Accumulating improbability until only a few explanations remained. The phone rang. Michael answered this time. Pine Ridge Archive. A woman's voice spoke in measured English with a faint accent he did not recognize immediately. This is Dr. Amina El-Sayed, Alexandria Maritime Historical Division. Michael's eyes lifted toward Eleanor at once. Another observer. Or another historian. Either way, the network was widening the search. We are listening, he said. I was forwarded your inquiry by Rotterdam, Amina said. We searched older port disturbance logs. I may have something relevant. Michael put the call on speaker. Eleanor reached for a fresh page. Amina continued. In 1861, before a severe harbor current reversal, a customs clerk noted a man standing near the water stairs. Not registered. No cargo. No vessel affiliation. Eleanor asked quietly, was he described? Yes. Paper rustled on the other end. Then Amina read from the old note. Dark plain coat. Dust on boots though the harbor had been washed by rain. He asked whether the clerk felt the water pulling sideways. Michael shut his eyes for a moment. The sea felt divided. The water felt heavier. The pressure in the corridor felt wrong. Each era gave the pattern different language, but the man always drew attention toward the pressure itself. Eleanor asked the next question. Did the record include anything else? Amina paused. Yes. The clerk added a personal note years later. He wrote that the man seemed familiar, though he was certain they had never met. Michael opened his eyes. Familiar. That too felt consistent. The stranger never entered a room like a shock. He entered like someone the moment had somehow already made space for. After the call ended, Eleanor added Alexandria to the board. Then she began drawing lines between every record that mentioned the man directly. Atlantic. London. India. Rotterdam. Alexandria. Pine Ridge. Kansas Rail Office. Airport parking structure. 1911 wildfire image. More than a trail now. Almost a circuit. Michael looked at the board and felt the question arrive before he spoke it. If he has always been there. Eleanor looked up from the notes. What has he been waiting for? The room held that question longer than the others. Because it was not only about identity. It was about purpose. If the man preserved continuity between observers, then to what end? Not merely to keep the pattern from being forgotten. Something larger. Something patient. The silent network had awakened. The decision line had bent. The global spiral had become visible. And across more than 2 centuries of records, the same man had remained near the pressure field as if history itself kept encountering him at the threshold between imbalance and choice. Michael looked toward the door. He did not guide us here just to satisfy curiosity. Eleanor shook her head. No. She looked back at the board. He waited for something. Michael followed her gaze from the oldest Atlantic note to the newest global records. Then he understood what the shape of the evidence was suggesting. Not waiting for an event. Waiting for enough observers to exist at the same time. Waiting for the network. Outside, the wind shifted gently through the maple trees. Inside the archive, the board of descriptions now looked less like a collection of coincidences and more like a long-held intention. The man had not only been present. He had been preparing continuity. And the more clearly that truth emerged, the more another question took its place. Not who he was. Not even how long he had lived. But why someone would remain near the spiral for centuries unless he believed the world was moving toward a moment none of the earlier observers had yet reached. A moment still ahead. A moment he had always known would come. For the next hour, the board at the center of the archive became the most unsettling object in the room. Not because it offered certainty. Because it offered direction. Descriptions from different centuries had now begun aligning too closely to dismiss. Plain coat. Dust on boots. Calm expression. Voice low, precise, and brief. Questions that shifted attention toward pressure without forcing a conclusion. Departure before the event fully closed. And beneath all of that, a deeper pattern had begun surfacing. The man did not merely appear before storms divided or systems corrected. He appeared before observers recognized what they were seeing. Eleanor Hayes was the first to say it out loud. She stood in front of the cork board with one hand resting against the edge of the table. We have been asking the wrong question. Michael Carter looked up from the notes he had been reviewing. What question? She turned toward him. Not who he is. Then what? Eleanor glanced back at the cluster of documents. When he appears. Michael frowned slightly. He appears before pressure events. Yes, Eleanor said. But more specifically, he appears before recognition. Michael was quiet for a moment. Then he stood and moved closer to the board. Eleanor pointed to the Atlantic note from Jonathan Hale. He asks whether the sea feels divided before Hale persuades the captain to alter course. Then to London. He asks whether the engineer trusts the bridge more than the water before work is halted. To India. He draws attention westward before the surveyor redirects the villagers. To Michael's airport encounter. He says pressure responds before you. Understand the spiral is larger than aviation. Then to Pine Ridge. He tells me observers eventually meet before the network begins to form. Michael followed the sequence slowly. At first it looked like coincidence. Then like method. The stranger did not arrive only before redistribution. He arrived before a person or system crossed from vague unease into meaningful recognition. He appeared at thresholds. Michael spoke softly. He does not guide events. Eleanor nodded. He guides awareness. The distinction changed everything. Because if that was true, then the stranger was not just standing beside the spiral. He was standing beside the moment when someone learned how to see it. Michael looked at the board again. That would explain why he appears in so many different systems. Storms. Rivers. Harbors. Rail schedules. Power grids. Flight corridors. He was not tied to any one mechanism. He was tied to attention. The archive computer chimed again. A new file had arrived from Osaka. Kenji Tanaka had titled it, Historical Rail Archive, Recurring Witness Note. Eleanor opened it. The scanned page showed a 1908 dispatch record from a small rail exchange outside Kyoto. The record itself concerned a timing irregularity that later prevented a mechanical conflict at a crossing. But Kenji had highlighted a margin note added years later by the dispatcher's daughter, who had preserved his papers. Eleanor read aloud. My father once said a quiet foreign traveler asked him whether the train yard sounded faster than the clock. He laughed at the question. Then, moments later, he realized the departure order had compressed in a way he had not consciously noticed. Michael inhaled softly. The phrase was perfect. Not a warning. A question tuned to perception. The stranger did not hand people answers. He adjusted their attention until they could see what was already there. Eleanor placed the Osaka note on the board and stepped back. He appears before the observer becomes an observer. Michael nodded slowly. And if that is true? He stopped. Because a more unsettling thought had formed underneath the first one. The stranger had not only appeared before spiral events. He had appeared before transitions in scale. Before Jonathan Hale's Atlantic course change. Before London's infrastructure recognition. Before Harold Bennett's aviation record. Before Pine Ridge's archive awakening. Before the global network. Michael spoke the thought carefully. He shows up when the pattern is about to become visible in a new way. Eleanor turned toward him at once. That was it. Not merely before events. Before expansions of understanding. The stranger did not only stand near the spiral. He stood near the places where the world's picture of the spiral widened. The board suddenly looked different again. Not just a trail of presence. A trail of thresholds. Atlantic navigation. Industrial infrastructure. Colonial rail timing. Rural weather records. Commercial aviation. Global systems. Each time the pattern crossed into a new layer of human organization, the man seemed to be there first, or at least early enough to shape the first observer's attention. Eleanor whispered, almost to herself, he was not waiting for storms. Michael heard her. He was waiting for scale. The sentence settled into the archive like a hidden gear finally locking into place. If true, it meant the stranger had spent centuries not merely preserving continuity between observers, but preparing them for broader forms of recognition. From local weather to regional systems. From isolated incidents to the silent network. And perhaps beyond even that. The phone rang. Michael answered. Pine Ridge Archive. Lena Vermeer's voice came through immediately. I found something else. Her tone was different this time. Less curious. More certain. We pulled an older shipping testimony from an insurance archive. 1791. North Atlantic again. Different vessel. Michael turned on the speaker. Eleanor grabbed a fresh page. Lena continued. The witness description is brief, but the captain wrote that a man who was not on the crew roster asked whether the ship was following the stars or following habit. Michael closed his eyes for a second. Following habit. Again, the same method. Attention redirected from procedure to pressure. Lena added one more line. The captain says he did not understand the question until after the heading changed and the storm lane split. When the call ended, Eleanor did not move right away. She placed the new note beside Jonathan Hale's record. Then she drew a small bracket across the board connecting several clusters. Before recognition, before scale change, before network expansion. Michael read the labels, then looked toward the door. So the board is not asking who he was. Eleanor nodded. It is asking what he has been doing. Michael finished the thought. Teaching the spiral to remain visible across generations. The stranger had never stayed. Never centralized authority. Never collected followers. If anything, he seemed to resist becoming the center of any room he entered. That too now made more sense. If his role was continuity of awareness, then remaining peripheral was essential. Observers had to remain the ones who chose. Otherwise the spiral would stop being a pattern of human decisions and become merely obedience. Eleanor looked again at the oldest records. Jonathan Hale did not need to believe in mystery. He needed only to feel the sea differently enough to speak. Melissa Grant did not need to understand the whole spiral. She needed only to trust 6 minutes of margin. The stranger's role had never been to create believers. It had been to preserve the moment before recognition hardened into action. Michael spoke quietly. Then maybe he was never waiting for the spiral. Eleanor looked up. He held her gaze for a second. Then asked the question that seemed to move through the room before either of them fully understood its shape. Was he waiting for us? Silence followed. Because for the first time, the question did not sound metaphorical. The global spiral had become visible. The silent network had formed. The decision line had bent. If the stranger appeared before every widening of recognition, then perhaps everything in the archive, every record, every preserved clue, every question asked at the edge of a pressure field, had been leading not simply toward understanding the spiral, but toward a generation of observers able to see it together. Eleanor turned back to the board. The documents no longer felt like evidence of a recurring anomaly. They felt like scaffolding. An architecture of preparation. And somewhere in that realization was a truth she did not yet know how to say cleanly. Not that the man had manipulated history. Not that he controlled the spiral. But that he may have spent centuries making sure the world would not miss the moment when the spiral finally became visible enough to matter. Outside, wind moved softly through the maple leaves beside the courthouse. Inside, the archive no longer seemed like a repository of old storms and quiet records. It felt like a room built to survive long enough for one particular threshold. And maybe, Eleanor thought, it just crossed it. By early afternoon, the board inside the Pine Ridge archive no longer looked like a research project. It looked like a timeline that had been waiting centuries to reveal its shape. Descriptions from the Atlantic. Notes from London. Survey records from India. Rail dispatch margins from Japan. Shipping ledgers from Rotterdam. Harbor testimony from Alexandria. The Kansas Corridor. Pine Ridge itself. And in each cluster of events, the same kind of figure appeared. Never central. Never official. But always present just before the observer recognized the imbalance. Eleanor Hayes stood several steps back from the board. She had spent the morning comparing every description again, looking for the detail that would break the pattern. Age difference. Accent change. Inconsistent clothing. Anything that would prove the witnesses had simply described different men who shared ordinary features. But the opposite kept happening. The descriptions aligned more tightly the longer she examined them. Michael Carter leaned against the archive table with his arms folded. "You are trying to disprove it." Eleanor nodded. "Yes." "And?" She did not answer immediately. Finally she said quietly, "I cannot." Michael looked at the photograph Sofia Alvarez had sent the night before. The 1911 wildfire image. The man at the edge of the frame stood slightly apart from the others. Not commanding. Not assisting. Just present. The photograph was grainy and imperfect, but the posture was unmistakable. Michael exhaled slowly. So we either accept that witnesses across 2.5 centuries somehow described the same person. He paused. Or we accept something stranger. Eleanor finished the thought. That the records are accurate. The archive computer chimed again. A new file had arrived from Alexandria. Dr. Amina El Sayed had titled it, Recovered Maritime Document, 1768. Michael looked at Eleanor immediately. That is earlier than Hale. Eleanor opened the file. The scanned page showed a fragile navigation log preserved in a museum archive. The ink had faded to a pale brown, but the handwriting remained legible. The entry described a trading vessel encountering unstable wind patterns several days before a storm system formed. The navigator had written that the sea felt divided in an unusual way. Eleanor read the next line aloud. A traveler aboard the vessel remarked that the wind seemed to be choosing between two directions. Michael looked up sharply. Choosing between two directions. The phrasing felt eerily similar to the language used in the Pine Ridge spiral records. But what came next made Eleanor stop reading entirely. Michael noticed. What is it? Eleanor rotated the screen toward him. Beneath the entry, the navigator had drawn a small spiral. And beside it, he had written a note. Not about the wind. About the traveler. Michael read it slowly. The same man I saw years earlier near the harbor at Cadiz. The words sat on the screen like something out of place in time. Years earlier. Which meant the navigator had already encountered the man before the voyage began. Michael spoke carefully. So this is not only the earliest spiral record. Eleanor nodded. It is the earliest reference to him. Michael felt the quiet weight of that moment. Before Jonathan Hale. Before the London engineer. Before any of the records the archive had previously treated as the beginning of the pattern. The stranger had already been present. And the navigator who wrote the log had noticed the repetition even then. Eleanor scrolled further down the page. Another line had been added near the bottom of the log. The handwriting looked slightly different, perhaps written later. Michael leaned closer. The sentence read, "He asks questions as though he has seen the sea make this decision before." The room fell silent. Because the line carried an implication too large to dismiss easily. The navigator had not simply thought the man perceptive. He had thought the man familiar with the moment itself. Michael finally spoke. "If this record is authentic." Eleanor finished the thought. Then he was already moving between pressure events before the spiral was even recognized. Michael leaned back from the table. So he did not follow the pattern. He preceded it. The stranger standing near the archive window had been silent through the entire exchange. Now he spoke. Patterns are easier to see after they repeat. Michael turned toward him. "You already knew about that document." The man did not deny it. "Yes." Eleanor studied him carefully. "You have been guiding observers for longer than our records even begin." The stranger considered the words. Then he answered quietly. "I have been present." Michael crossed his arms. "That is not the same thing." The stranger met his gaze. "No." The difference between the two sentences carried more weight than either of them expected. Michael stepped closer. "Why?" It was the simplest question in the room, and the hardest to answer. The stranger looked at the board of records. Then at the spiral map. Finally he spoke. "Because the spiral is not the most important pattern." Eleanor frowned slightly. "What is?" The stranger gestured toward the archive. "Observers." The word hung in the air. Michael waited. The stranger continued. "For centuries the spiral appeared in isolated places. A storm. A harbor. A bridge. A train yard." He pointed to the global spiral map. But the pattern was never meant to remain isolated. Eleanor understood the implication slowly. It was meant to connect. The stranger nodded. "Yes." Michael looked back at the Cadiz record. "So you were not waiting for the spiral to grow?" "No." "Then what were you waiting for?" The stranger answered with quiet clarity. "For the moment when observers could see each other." The sentence seemed to shift the entire board of evidence into a new shape. Every record. Every margin note. Every question asked beside a pressure event. They were not random appearances. They were continuity markers. Moments when awareness was preserved long enough for the next observer to notice. Eleanor whispered softly, "You were keeping the line alive." The stranger did not respond immediately. Finally he said, "I was keeping the door open." Michael looked again at the spiral on the wall. For the first time since discovering the pattern, he felt as if the mystery had moved beyond the question of identity. It had become something else entirely. Not who the man was. But what moment he had been preparing the world to reach. Because if observers across centuries had been guided toward recognition slowly enough to preserve the pattern, then perhaps the global network forming now was not an accident. It was the point. Eleanor spoke quietly. "If the spiral was never the destination." Michael finished the thought. "Then something comes after it." The stranger did not answer. But the silence itself felt like confirmation. Outside the archive windows, wind moved through the courthouse trees. Across the board of evidence, the spiral and the man who stood beside it for centuries now looked less like a mystery and more like preparation. And if preparation had lasted more than 250 years, then the moment it had been preparing for could not be small. For several long moments after the stranger said he had been keeping the door open, no one inside the Pine Ridge archive spoke. The phrase lingered in the room because it shifted everything without fully explaining anything. A door to what? A door for whom? Michael. Carter stood near the evidence board, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, as if he needed the physical weight of the wood to remain grounded inside a conversation that no longer felt entirely attached to ordinary time. Eleanor Hayes remained beside the computer where the 1768 Cadiz record still glowed on the screen. The earliest known mention of the man. Not as rumor. Not as myth. As a witness note written by someone who thought he had seen the same traveler before. That was the part Eleanor could not stop circling back to. The records had not inflated over time. They had repeated. Quietly. Reluctantly. As though history itself had been leaving small admissions in the margins whenever the pressure rose enough. Michael looked toward the stranger. If you were keeping the door open, he said, then for what? The man did not answer immediately. Instead he walked slowly toward the spiral map on the wall. The global curve remained pinned across oceans and continents. Rotterdam. Osaka. Hudson Bay. Pine Ridge. Buenos Aires. The Indian Ocean. The Black Sea. The Western Pacific. Kansas City along the decision line. A pattern that no previous generation of observers had ever seen whole. He studied it for several seconds. Then he turned back toward them. For the moment when the pattern stopped being hidden. Eleanor frowned slightly. The global spiral is already visible. Yes, the stranger said. But visibility is not the same as understanding. Michael crossed his arms. Then what are we still missing? The stranger's expression did not change. The spiral was never the destination. Silence filled the archive again. Not because the sentence was confusing. Because it landed with the force of something both impossible and inevitable. Eleanor spoke first. If the spiral is not the destination, then what is? The stranger looked toward the evidence board. Toward Jonathan Hale. Toward Cadiz. Toward London. Toward the wildfire photograph from 1911. Toward the records that had preserved generations of observers without ever fully connecting them. Then he answered in the same calm voice he had used from the beginning. It was the signal. Michael felt the full shape of the season move beneath that sentence. Storms splitting. Rivers diverting. Pressure timing feeling wrong. Small decisions widening margin. The global spiral. The silent network. All of it suddenly rearranged itself. Not as the final mystery. As the means. Of recognition. A signal. Something meant to be seen, not worshipped. Understood, not merely recorded. He spoke slowly. A signal of what? The stranger met his eyes. That the world had become connected enough for observers to matter together. Eleanor drew in a quiet breath. Not because the idea was shocking. Because it explained too much at once. For centuries the spiral had appeared in fragments. A ship's route. A harbor current. A bridge. A train yard. A rural storm. An aircraft corridor. Each observer saw only one pressure field at a time because human systems were not yet connected enough to reveal anything larger. But now the systems touched one another constantly. Shipping influenced manufacturing. Weather influenced power demand. Data corridors influenced routing. Rail timing affected freight movement, which affected energy load, which affected everything else. The world had become a single interacting field of pressures. And only then had the spiral become visible on a planetary scale. Michael looked back at the map. So you were not trying to preserve the symbol? No, said the stranger. I was trying to preserve the possibility that, when the signal became visible, someone would know how to read it. That sentence settled even deeper. Eleanor looked at the older ledgers spread across the table. The first archivist of Pine Ridge. The handwritten margins. Harold Bennett's compass. Melissa Grant's 6-minute adjustment. Each one now looked less like an isolated act of insight and more like a relay. Not a chain of control. A chain of literacy. The world had been slowly taught how to notice pressure. How to see the moment before a system hardened. How to recognize that decision and redistribution were never as separate as they seemed. She asked the next question quietly. What comes after the signal? For the first time, the stranger did not answer right away. He looked older in that pause, though not in the ordinary physical way records would measure. Older in the sense that a person might look when finally arriving at the reason they endured a very long road. Then he said, coordination. Michael narrowed his eyes slightly. The silent network. The stranger nodded. Yes. But not only as correspondence. Not only as reporting. Eleanor understood before he finished. As shared judgment. Exactly. Michael thought back to Kansas City. The 6-minute decision had not come from prophecy or authority. It came from a local observer with system knowledge, a global pattern visible in Pine Ridge, and a small recommendation made at the right time. No one controlled the future. But the network widened what the future could become. He said it aloud. The signal tells observers when they are no longer isolated. Yes. And the network is what happens after that. Yes. Outside, the wind moved gently through the courthouse trees. Inside, the archive had become something larger than a room full of records. It felt like the first stable point in a world learning to see its own pressure. Eleanor looked toward the evidence board again. If that was the purpose all along, then you were never waiting for one final event. The stranger's voice was quiet. No. You were waiting for a threshold. Yes. Michael followed the thought. The threshold where enough observers existed at once, in enough connected systems, to recognize the signal together. The stranger nodded. And suddenly the centuries of continuity no longer seemed impossible in the same way. Not because they were less strange. Because they had become legible. A patient task. A recurring role. Stand near the edge of the pressure field. Ask the question that makes the observer look correctly. Leave before the decision becomes someone else's. Repeat that long enough, across generations, and eventually the world produces not just isolated witnesses, but a network. Eleanor spoke carefully. Then why show yourself to us now? The stranger looked at her for a long moment before answering. Because the signal has already been seen. It was the simplest answer possible. And perhaps the most unsettling. Nothing hidden remained necessary now that the global spiral had become visible. The role of the stranger as a quiet margin presence had belonged to an era of incomplete recognition. But if the network had awakened, then perhaps history was crossing into a different phase. Michael voiced the thought. So you are no longer needed the same way. A faint smile appeared at the corner of the stranger's expression. That depends on what comes next. The sentence left room for more than one meaning, and neither Michael nor Eleanor pushed him to narrow it. Some truths became clearer only when left enough silence around them. The archive phone rang. All three turned toward it. Eleanor answered. This is Pine Ridge. Lena Vermeer's voice came through first, but not alone. Others were on the line too. Kenji Tanaka in Osaka. Sofia Alvarez in Buenos Aires. Melissa Grant in Kansas City. A shared call. Not routed through accident, but arranged deliberately. Michael stepped closer as Eleanor activated the speaker. For the first time, the core members of the silent network were hearing one another together. The voices were cautious at first. Professional. Measured. Then Lena said what all of them had been circling in their own way since the global spiral became visible. We do not only need a place to send records anymore. Kenji answered quietly, we need a way to think together before the pressure closes. Melissa added, the corridor bent because knowledge arrived in time. Sophia finished the thought. Which means the network itself is now part of the margin. Eleanor looked toward Michael. Then toward the stranger. No one in the room needed to say it out loud. The threshold had already been crossed. What the stranger had kept open through centuries of isolated observers was no longer a door into recognition alone. It was now opening into something else entirely. A structure. A practice. A responsibility shared before the line bent. Michael leaned toward the speaker. Then we begin building for that. No dramatic vote followed. No declaration. Only a quiet series of agreements. A secure channel for reports. Shared timing protocols. Cross-system observation windows. Historical archives linked to live anomalies. The first real architecture of the silent network taking shape in ordinary language spoken by ordinary people. That, Eleanor thought, might be the most important part of all. Not greatness. Not spectacle. Just people listening carefully enough, together enough, long enough, to widen margin where they could. When the call ended, the archive felt changed again. Not by mystery this time. By direction. Eleanor closed the older ledger gently and placed it beside the new one. The old era and the new one touching along a single desk. Michael picked up Harold Bennett's compass and turned it once in his hand before setting it back down. The spiral on its rim no longer felt like a relic. It felt like a message that had finally arrived where it was supposed to. The stranger moved toward the door. Neither Michael nor Eleanor tried to stop him. At the threshold, he paused and looked back at the map, the ledgers, the board, and the two of them standing between centuries of records and a future still trying to take shape. Then he said the sentence that would remain with them long after the sound of his footsteps disappeared across the square. The spiral was never the destination. It was the signal. What you build after it is the future. Then he stepped outside into the late afternoon light and was gone. No rush. No vanishing trick. Just a man in a plain coat walking out of the archive as he had walked into records for more than 2.5 centuries. Eleanor stood still for a long moment. Then she looked at Michael. He was waiting for the network. Michael nodded. Yes. Outside, Pine Ridge remained what it had always been on the surface. A quiet town behind a courthouse square. But inside the archive, the meaning of history had changed. The spiral had been seen. The signal had been recognized. And now the future no longer belonged only to the systems that gathered pressure. It also belonged to the people who noticed in time. In forgotten places, where wind carries memory and silence watches patiently, justice does not shout. It whispers. And every act leaves an echo. You have been listening to Whispers of Reckoning. The spiral was never the end of the mystery. It was the beginning of recognition. And when enough people learn to see the signal together, history stops being something they only inherit. It becomes something they help shape. Pressure gathers. Until someone listens. And every act leaves an echo.